on the slide.
Yep.
Yeah.
If
you have any chance to look at them, please do. It might give you some, way to challenge what you learn. The challenge for improving your chances of understanding what is happening right now. Okay, so.
Okay, no, thank you. Okay. What I'm going to be talking about is how to derive macroeconomics in a totally different way to what you've been presumably learning it beforehand. And it's related to the post-Keynesian School of Economics, but I'm showing what you can call post-Keynesian economics, some of the essential elements of it, pop straight out of macroeconomic identities. So you've all been studying DSGE models, I imagine, real business cycle, okay, banks as intermediaries, etc., etc. I regard that all as garbage. I might as well be frank. I have no time for it. But I can see where the desire to do that came from, because the real driving force in the development of mainstream macroeconomics was to make it consistent with microeconomics. This is a quote from Lucas, just after he became head of the president of the American Economic Association. And he says his ambition was the theory ought to be microeconomically founded, unified with price theory. And that's trying to give it a sound foundation, which is not a bad idea initially, the idea of the sound foundation. But it was a bad idea for a number of reasons to build micro foundations. One is that the micro you've learned is a series of myths. The whole idea of rising marginal cost, for example. Every single survey that's been done of actual businesses finds that the majority of them have declining marginal cost. Okay? The smallest sample return was 89% of businesses have constant or falling marginal cost. The standard result was 95% of businesses report they have constant or falling marginal cost. So that's one element of what you're taught that's wrong. If you look at the whole idea of utility maximising behaviour, it works nice and easily when you draw a graph with two axes and then imagine where's the point of tangency between a budget line and an indifference surface. But when that's tried experimentally, even with just 8 commodities, this is an experiment with university students to show them what their indifference curves were, which failed abjectly because 95% of the students violated all the axioms of revealed preference. So it was an attempt by the teacher to show how this actually makes sense, and he contradicted the theory. It's a very, very good paper. Even if you could derive a demand curve for each individual, given their budget line and the preferences, and find that they did obey all those rules, mathematically you can't derive downward sloping market demand curves from individual downward sloping demand curves. And that's an aggregation problem. It's a common issue in science. Economists discovered it by accident. They have pretty much ignored the results or distorted the result. This is where the idea of the representative agent came from. The only way you can get the aggregation to work is if we're all the same. Not only are we all the same, all commodities have to be identical as well, which is nonsense. So there's a huge amount of myths in the foundation of micro. But even if that wasn't the case, what physicists have come to realise over time, and this is going back 50 years, this particular paper, virtually half a century ago, is that you can't derive a high level of analysis from a lower level. So we all think about, we've been schooled in a reductionist approach to science, to say we can understand a complex problem by breaking it down to its constituents. And that's often what we do. But what economics is trying to do is start from the constituents and build the upper level theory. Okay. Now you can to some extent go from the top down, analyse a problem at a base level. That doesn't mean you can construct from the bottom up. And this is a wonderful paper by a genuine Nobel Prize winner in physics, Philip Anderson. Very literary. It's a very good explanation of why you simply can't do what microeconomics was trying to do. And then finally, even though all that was okay, the models they built didn't see the financial crisis coming. So there's a whole layer of failures in conventional economic theory. By the way, am I going too fast, or my voice is my speaking speed okay? Good. A bit slower. Okay. So this was probably my favourite piece of mainstream economic analysis and prediction before the financial crisis, which came out in June and told politicians the current economic situation is in many ways better than we've experienced in years, and our central forecast is quite benign. 2 months before what is regarded as the beginning of the crisis. So complete abject failure to see what was coming. And then after the crisis, you see macroeconomists are still in denial to some extent about their failure, because this is Olivier Blanchard, and he published this working paper in August of 2008. It was later published as a journal paper, but I used the working paper date because I literally was at the computer and I got a message to say the paper had been posted to a working paper archive. So he posted this paper saying the state of macro is good 1 year after the crisis began, and matter of days, be one side or the other, of the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And then at least Olivier has reconsidered his position to some extent, but it's incredibly hard for him to move away from thinking in the same equilibrium microfounded terms. So he had a set of papers discussing what can we do to bring about a decent macro after the failure of the financial crisis. And he says, well, we have to start from explicit microfoundations. Why? It is hard to see where else to start from. Okay. That's not a convincing foundation. Now, he then had a range of comments on this paper, and he and I occasionally correspond on direct messages on Twitter, quite a friendly correspondence. And he got some comments from me as well. He included me in the list of people he'd consulted in this paper. And he said, there's wide agreement on the following 3 propositions. Let's not discuss them any further and move on. Well, the first one is macroeconomics is about general equilibrium. And I just said, absolutely not. It's about general evolutionary dynamics. And we need to be able to think in that fashion. And neoclassical micro is just a completely wrong way to start. In fact, I think I would regard that economics would be improved if we got rid of microeconomics completely. It doesn't teach anything of value. It distorts how you think about the real world. So I want to show you can actually derive macroeconomics directly from macro and start from a set of definitions that are simply incontrovertible. So the employment rate, and I've used lambda for the lowercase Greek l for the rate of employment, is the number of workers with a job divided by the population, L divided by M. And that's a definition. It's very hard to disagree with the definition. The wages share of GDP, which I use omega for, is the level of wages divided by GDP. And I bring in the private debt to GDP ratio, which is not something neoclassical economists think should be part of macro. They're wrong. I'll show you that later, but I'll bring that in as well. And that is obviously simply the level of debt divided by GDP. Now, I need 2 more definitions to get anywhere. So I define the output to employment ratio, which we normally call labour productivity, and I'll slip into the same jargon at some points. But in my opinion, it's not labour productivity at all. It's, strictly speaking, it's the ratio of output to employment. And when you look at it in a deep sense, it's actually something about the level of energy processed by machines compared to the energy capability of a human being. And I'll show you that later. And the capital to output ratio, which again, there's a very big problem in defining what K is, which again, neoclassical economists gloss over, but that is a ratio. So V is equal to K divided by Y. Now, if you differentiate those with respect to time, and it's incredibly simple to do this, the basic rule is that if you're looking at a ratio, so you're looking at the rate of change of a ratio, you have it in percentage terms on one side, you break it down into 2 percentages on the other. The rate of change of 1 over x divided by y, ddt of x divided by y, is the rate percentage change of x minus the percentage change of y. So it's what one of my old mathematics lecturers used to call money for old rope. It's so simple, it's ridiculous you get paid to do it. Okay, that's all that's involved. So you apply it here. For example, looking at the labour ratio, then I say, well, the employment ratio here is the rate of change of the employment ratio is the rate of change of employment minus the rate of change of population. And then the rate of change of wages, the wages share, rate of change of wages minus rate of change of GDP, debt ratio the same. Very, very simple. It's not, you know how much time you have to spend to build a DSGE model. Okay, incredibly hard work. You start from the basic principles, and a few weeks later you might have got all the difference equation terms worked out and the utility side and profit maximising and whether ever imperfection. You are spending an enormous amount of time. This takes maybe 5 minutes. Now what you get out of that is 3 statements that are true by definition. So the first one, the employment ratio one, becomes the employment rate will rise if economic growth exceeds the sum of change in the output to labour ratio and population growth. And that's still a definitional statement. It's just stated now as a dynamic statement, not as a static definition. The wages share of output will rise if wages grow faster than GDP, and debt will rise if private debt grows faster than GDP. Okay, so we've still got a set of true statements, just now put in dynamic terms rather than as a simple definition. So the hat symbol there means 1 over x dx dt. So the percentage rate of growth, effectively, of the employment rate is the percentage growth of GDP minus the sum of the percentage rate of growth of labour to output ratio, output to labour ratio, and population. And ditto for the other two. And it's an incredibly simple process. That's to get the first equation. It's just 3 lines of working. So the first one, you separate it into the 2 components. That is now n hat. I'm just using the label for it. L is equal to y divided by a. You do it again for that, bang, there's your answer. So at this stage, I'm still working in strictly true definitions. And to make it into a model, you have to make some simplifying assumptions. But the simplifying assumptions I'm talking about actually are simplifying. When you look at what a neoclassical economist calls a simplifying assumption, I think there's a more correct term for it. It's normally a fantasy. So the simplifying assumption is representative agents. That is a fantasy that all individuals have parallel Engels curves, which means not just that people have comparable tastes, but their tastes don't change with income. Okay? So Bill Gates bought 1 toilet roll a week when he was earning, $10,000 a month. Now he's buying 1,000 toilet rolls. That's garbage. It's not a simplifying assumption, it's a fantasy. So my simple assumptions here, I'd have a exogenous rate of growth in the output to labour ratio. I could use alpha for that. And so the same for population, not looking at any feedback effect as yet, but you could bring a feedback effect in. A constant capital to labour ratio, you can make that variable later. And a uniform real wage, profit rate, and depreciation rate. And then to bring in behaviour to link the system states together, a linear rate of change of wages, a Phillips curve which is linear. You can obviously make that non-linear later, and it should be. And a linear function for investment, the level of investment as a percentage of GDP as a function of the rate of profit. So those are just the terms I'm going to use. So for this one, I've got the rate of change of wages as the slope of the function multiplied by the gap between the current employment level and a level at which wages don't change. And the investment function is a percentage of GDP, a slope, that's capital S, pi capital S, the slope of the function multiplied by the rate of profit minus a level at the rate of profit at which capitalists just invest all that they earn. So that level, profit equals investment equals profits. At a higher level, you have higher investment, but you've got to borrow money to finance it. And what I have there is I'm ignoring speculative borrowing. I've simply got firms borrowing money to finance real investment. So the rate of change of debt.
Would you repeat again? So just
yeah.
Plus 2, linear wage.
These two? Yeah, they're very simple linear functions. This is the slope of a straight line multiplied by the gap between the employment ratio. So that might be, say, 0.6, 60% of the population with a job, minus a level at which workers don't get wage rises. So that might be, say, 58% of the workforce, something like that. I'll show you that in a simulation shortly. And what you get out of it is what I regard as the simplest possible dynamic model of a monetary capitalist economy. The money is in there because you're using debt. You've got employment, which gives you the level of economic activity. You've got wage share of GDP, which gives you the distribution of income. So what you get is a three-dimensional model. And this is just spelling it out. The rate of change of the employment rate is the employment rate itself multiplied by the growth rate minus the sum of technical change, effectively, and population. A rate of change of wages share is the level of wages multiplied by wage change minus labour productivity. And the debt ratio is gross investment minus the profit share of output minus the debt ratio times the growth rate. And just to spell those other terms out, those are the other terms there. So the growth rate is gross investment divided by the capital output ratio minus depreciation. There's your investment function. The rate of profit is the profit share divided by the capital output ratio. Profit share is 1 minus wages share minus interest on debt, and that's the wage change function. So it's an incredibly simple model, and you wouldn't expect much interesting stuff to come out of it. And this is what a complex system tends to be, because a complex system doesn't mean complicated. It means the parts of the system interact with each other in a nonlinear way. So here I've got lambda multiplied by the growth rate, where the growth rate includes gross investment, and gross investment includes the rate of profit, which includes the distribution of income. Okay? So it's simple, but there are complex feedbacks between different parts of it. Now, the model with three system states has three equilibria. One of them is meaningless. It's negative values for everything. But the other two, there are two meaningful ones. One has a constant level of employment, constant wages share, and constant debt ratio. And that, that's an equilibrium you'd like to get to. Some of my fellow researchers call that the good equilibrium. And there's another one with zero employment, zero wages share, and infinite debt. That's the bad equilibrium. You don't want to get there. Now, you might imagine, and I did when I first developed this model, that there'd be two quite different processes leading up to it. In fact, they look very similar. And I'm going to show you a simulation software here, and then I said, well, if those of you have PCs with you, only one of you, so it's not going to really work all that well. But I'll show you how to download it and get a copy of it. This is the model simulated with a low up here, this value here. That is the slope of the profit function of 5. Okay. So I simulate it with a low level of desire to invest by capitalists. I get this process of a smooth convergence over time to an equilibrium level of the employment rate. The growth rate stabilizes. You get a constant debt ratio, a low level of debt compared to GDP. Okay? And that's, generally speaking, that's what neoclassicals think in terms of the stable equilibrium to which you converge after an exogenous shock. Okay? This is what happens if you have a higher level of desire to invest. So I've now gone from that being 5 to that being 10. And you can see what's happening. The cycles diminish and then start rising again. The growth rate stabilizes and then gets unstable. Okay? That's not at all the sort of behavior you can get out of a neoclassical model, but it's comparable to what we saw in the real world. Before the crisis occurred in 2007, neoclassical economists were congratulating themselves on the Great Moderation. I recommend you take a look at some papers with the title of Great Moderation and see how smug they were before the crisis hit. They ignored this factor. There was rising private debt to GDP. That was obvious in the data. Seeing that data is what led me to be aware there was going to be a crisis. I first looked at the data again in December of 2005 and saw this rising level of debt, and that to me was the signal there's going to be a crisis in the very near future. And most intriguingly, notice how this, over time, this is hang on, just changing the nature of my pointer here, pardon me. This is, and these graphs, on the horizontal axis you have profit share of GDP here and the debt ratio. And notice how that basically goes straight up. Okay? But this is the wages share of GDP and the debt ratio, and as the debt ratio rises, wages share falls. Now that is what's called an emergent property of the model. That's not built into the model at all. I didn't assume that would happen. It happens because of the dynamics of the model, which I can explain Took me a while to work out what was going on. But that's what we saw, rising inequality. So there are three system states for this model. There's the employment rate, there's the debt ratio, and the wages share of GDP. When you solve for the equilibrium, you find the equilibrium states are actually the employment rate, same thing, the debt ratio, same thing, and the profit share of output. So profit share tends to bounce around in equilibrium. As the debt level goes up, the worker's share goes down. And that's a direct cause of inequality, and it's also a sign of breakdown. So it doesn't take long to work out these equations, what the equilibria are. And they're moderately complicated compared to the initial equations, but quite straightforward to work out. And what you find is there's a direct negative relationship between the wages share of GDP and the debt ratio. So the equilibrium terms has the wages share of GDP as a residual. And because the capitalist share tends to be bouncing around a stable level, if the debt share is rising, the worker's share falls. So that's what actually happens in the model's dynamics that I showed you beforehand. So if you're near the good if you're going to converge to the good equilibrium, then inequality stabilizes. Okay, it's really only rising inequality people complain about. Stable all the time, not such a problem. But if you diverge to the bad equilibrium, then inequality rises, and it's not just not nice to have an unequal society. This is a prelude to a crisis. Okay? So inequality has macroeconomic effects that matter. And I can extend it to a model involving prices. Again, in a very simple way, you simply include the price level times real output to give you nominal output. So you include the price level inside there. And it doesn't take long to derive these expressions. The first term for employment rate doesn't get changed, but the wages share gets affected. You now have to take inflation into account as well as the growth rate in labour productivity. And in the private debt ratio, you have to take the inflation rate into account as well as the rate of economic growth. So you get to slightly more complicated equations. And the question is, how do you define a price level? Now, have anybody here learnt what's called Cholesky's markup pricing equation? Have you heard of that? Okay. It's a term that's derived by the economist Mikhail Kalecki, and it's a markup pricing equation which he derived in terms of what he called the degree of monopoly. I don't like imposing an equation that I can't derive from my own framework, so I didn't use Cholesky's equation. Instead, what I started with by saying that there's prices are a equilibrating mechanism between supply and demand. It sounds very neoclassical. But what I got out of it, and I'll show you that in a moment, is I got Cholesky's markup pricing equation. So I start from saying the rate of change of prices is some time constant, some rate of convergence multiplied by the gap between monetary supply and monetary demand. So if monetary supply exceeds monetary demand, prices will fall, okay, and vice versa. And then the actual monetary value of supply is the price level times real output. Real output can be treated as labour times the labour output ratio. The labour itself can be treated as the total wage bill divided by the wage rate. And the wage share of GDP is wages get some fraction of GDP. So I'm using S to represent the share going to capitalists in terms of gross profit. So 1 minus S times monetary output goes to workers. Now, if you substitute all that into the expression for monetary value of supply, and then say you're living in a demand-driven economy, so monetary demand is equal to GDP, you get an equilibrium expression. And when you work it out, you find that the equilibrium price is 1 over 1 minus S, where S is greater than 0, so that's numbers greater than 1, multiplied by the money wage divided by labour productivity. And that's Cholesky's pricing equation. Now, to put that in a dynamic sense, I can take this equation and say, well, rather than saying it's convergence of supply and demand, it's convergence to equilibrium price. So that's the mechanism that gives me that effect. So this is a minus here. So if price is greater than equilibrium price, this is positive. The overall expression is negative, so prices fall. That's your equilibrating mechanism. And I can then express that in terms of the wages share of GDP. It doesn't take long. You start off from this expression, multiplied by L over L. L times WM becomes, that's the money wage. That's the number of workers. That becomes the wages bill. And I've now got A times L here, which is real output. And I multiplied by prices, by price over price. And I've now got price times real output on the bottom. That gives you the money value of output dividing the wage bill multiplied by price. And substitute that in the inflation expression. And I finally get an expression for the rate of inflation as a function of the rate of conversions of prices, the markup, the share of the output going to capitalists, and the wages share of GDP. So what you get out of this is if wage share is falling, you're going to have falling prices as well. Okay? So if there's a falling share of workers' share of GDP, you're going to have deflation. And that's what, again, we can see in the West right now. Again, this is a puzzle for all the central banks. Why is the rate of inflation so low? This is why. Okay? So I put it all together, still working with linear expressions. It's not the only complication is this has been added, IR for the inflation rate, to the original set of equations. And I've got as well, because I've now got a nominal model rather than a real, I have to have a nominal rate of the interest rate. And I've got here saying that rate of interest is a base rate, which would be set by the central bank. And one thing you could do with this model, by the way, is explore what happens if the central bank follows a Taylor rule on RB. What does that do to the model? It probably causes a collapse or it accelerates one. And then a conditional addition of an inflation rate. If inflation is greater than zero, then you have a markup. Otherwise, you don't mark up banks don't reduce the interest rate because of inflation being less than zero. Maybe that's been challenged by what's happening in Denmark now, where you can actually get negative mortgage rates, but that's the basic model there. What do you get out of that? And I'm now going to show you what it looks like in the software package I want you to download and play with later. Has anybody seen a program that looks like this before? Okay. There's a whole area of computing called system dynamics. And it was invented back in the 1950s by a brilliant engineer called J. Forrester. And then it diverged in two streams. One was software used by marketing and management people. So this program is called VenSim, I think, Stellar, quite a few others. And the other was engineers using it to design physical objects. So anybody driving a car here less than 10 years old, almost certainly the car was designed in software using system dynamic style software before it was built. And what it lets you do is model the system as a dynamic process. So that set of equations I said to you beforehand, that's the equation for the employment rate. And these equations are expressed in terms of integrals rather than differential equations. The reason for that is that integration is a smoother process than differentiation. So to do this, you use integrals rather than differentials. You basically take a differential equation and then just re-express it as an integral equation. And that's the rate of change of the employment rate, which is the employment rate multiplied by the growth rate minus the sum of labour productivity and population growth. And in fact, if you click on the equation tab here, you'll see the equations written out as I showed you earlier. So those, let's see, those are the equations there for the rate of change of debt, rate of change of employment, rate of change of wages share. And once you've done that, you can simulate the model. And you saw the big cycles I got out of the previous model. Now you're getting very damped cycles. You've also got inflation falling over time, income distribution going in favour of bankers, the same thing I showed you earlier with the model without prices. And keep it going on for long enough, And just when it looks like it's reached equilibrium, that's when the system starts to collapse. So we're getting much, much closer to the real world by starting from simple definitions, simple calculus, and then putting together a model which can model the system dynamically rather than assuming equilibrium. And so that software itself, by the way, just to show you, it's open source, called Minsky. If you go to SourceForge, has anybody here downloaded software from SourceForge at all? You haven't? Okay, so it's a repository for open source software. So sourceforge.net, and if you search for, let's just type the word SourceForge and Minsky, and it'll happen very rapidly on my machine because I download it all the time, of course, because it's my software. So SourceForge is one word, and Minsky, and your browser should bring that up as the first option. And then just click on download. At the moment, we're doing a very rapid development of it, courtesy of finally getting some decent funding to build it. So it's going through a whole series of what we call beta. You know the expression beta software? Okay, so the beta software is actually better to use at the moment than the release software. So the last beta was released 2 days ago, and just click on that and choose download either the Mac or the Windows version. And then you can install it on your own PC and play with the models I'm showing you at the moment. So when I include a more complicated model with nonlinear behavior and a three-factor Phillips curve, one thing I really want you to do is do not trust your textbooks. Don't trust them. They lie to you. The text authors don't actually know they're lying because they often don't read the originals themselves. So go and read the originals. If you look at Phillips, the paper about the Phillips curve, it wasn't a single factor relationship between rate of change of wages and employment. It was the rate of change of wages and employment, the rate of change of employment, and the inflation rate. And the reason he didn't fit that himself in the data is that he only had, I think he had about 150 data points. You're doing it on a hand-operated calculator. He reduced it to 7 ranges and fitted one variable to 7 ranges. There's no possibility of fitting the entire concept he had there, but when we model it, we can include all 3 factors. So I've done that in this particular model. Again, that's showing it in terms of it looks complicated, but they're quite simple. There's only a small number of constants there. So I have an inflation-adjusted nominal interest rate, a time lag determining inflation, as I showed you earlier, the markup equation, inflation affecting the wages share and the debt ratio, and then a lagged response of inflation that I didn't include in that previous model. So I've got an instant response to inflation in the model I showed you a moment ago. This is a lag response. And when you put that all together, you get a model that behaves like this. I'll just bring that up and show it to you. All these things here, by the way, there's like this set of units here. I'll just drag it up there. That's just a definition. If I zoom in and take a look at what it is. Pardon me. Great, looks like I've triggered a bug. I hope I can get past it. Okay. It's defining the nonlinear wage change function. I've got a linear and a linear function inside there. That's all that's defining. But if I now simulate this model, and I'll start with a larger scale. This is the sort of default scale of the model. So you've got the employment rate, wages share of GDP, profit share, inflation rate, debt ratio, and the interest rate. And this is plotting the debt ratio against wages share of GDP and the debt ratio against the employment rate. And over here, the banker's share, and at this point, the share, all the income shares in the model. So let's simulate that. And what you got, first of all, the period of cycles look like they're diminishing. Then they start to rise again, which might be like the 1960s and 70s, 80s inflation experience in the West. Then it all seems to stabilise, and notice how the profit share here is finally becoming a straight line. Okay, What's being ignored by conventional thinking is the rising level of private debt to GDP. As the debt ratio is going up, the employment rate's falling. The interest rate has gone down to the base rate because you're now having deflation. And wages share of GDP is declining, but it's now falling as fast as it can, not fast enough to counteract the interest on debt. Keep on going, and the system collapses. And the last people to know it's going to collapse are the capitalists, because as far as they're concerned, for the last 20 years, everything is nice and stable. Okay. So that's a more complicated but still simple to derive model about the nature of capitalism with finance. And it answers the question that Minsky... Has anybody here read any Hyman Minsky? Okay. What have you read? Which book or articles? You can't remember? There's a little book of his called Can It Happen Again? And I think that's probably the best book to read by him. Very simple, short articles, basically his collected writings. He writes very well in short articles. He didn't write all that well in large books. But John Maynard Keynes, which is the first book he wrote, that's worth reading. It's an exceptional... That's what got me onto this whole area of modelling. I read that when I was doing my master's degree in 1987. And so I highly recommend reading John Maynard Keynes. It's probably a bit overwhelming in first draft though, so the best book is Can It Happen Again? And that's got a whole set of short essays. And he writes beautifully when he writes in a short punchy article. So I just love this statement. The most significant event of the era since World War II is something that has not happened. There has not been a deep and long-lasting depression. And he then says, by looking at history, to go 35 years without a crisis like that is extraordinary. And I'll show you some data on that shortly. So there's something about what happened after the Great Depression that gave you a functional system. And he said the real question in economics is not can a set of markets reach general equilibrium, which is the neoclassical way of thinking about it, but can it happen again? Can another Great Depression occur? That's a much more sensible, much more serious question. He said to answer it, you must have a model which makes Great Depressions one of the possible states of a capitalist economy. So he developed a verbal model of that but could never produce a mathematical model. What I've shown you is you can produce a mathematical model that generates what Minsky wants simply out of macroeconomic definitions. So you can add a government sector to the model. I did that in my first paper on this, which was published back in 1995. You can have multi-sectoral production, which I did. I haven't actually published that work. I did it for an Australian government institution for the United Nations Environment Program about 10 years ago. But it's feasible to model multi-sectoral production as well, and I'm adding that capability to Minsky as time goes on. So everything I've done there hasn't used an ounce of microeconomics. And I think it's actually a hindrance to economic thinking, not an assistance. And just to repeat, firms have falling marginal costs. The best article on that, the best book on that is by Alan Blinder. Not because it's a good book, it's because Alan Blinder was deputy president of the American Economic Association when he found this out. He had no idea that there'd been all this research by post-Keynesian economists showing marginal cost falls. He found it out by accident. So chapter 4 of that book is a remarkable statement of empirical data by somebody who wasn't expecting to find what he found. And the survey that he did, he had PhD students asking the questions, and the firms that they interviewed, he worked out represented 15% of America's GDP. Okay, so it's not a tiny sample you can ignore by people who don't know what they're doing. These were neoclassically trained, DSG modelling type of economists asking questions of major corporations in the northeastern quarter of America. And that's what they found. And the other papers are better papers because Fred Lee and Eitman both knew that they'd find what they did find, which is falling marginal cost. Individuals don't maximise utility. It's a waste of time to model their behaviour that way. You can't get downward sloping market demand curves. But the point I want to go to now is you can't even get a theory of money out of micro. If you look at all the attempts by neoclassicals to explain why money exists, they struggle. And again, as you found yourselves in doing any of the modelling of neoclassical modelling, It's really, really hard work to even construct a basic vanilla real business cycle model. And you get, as I've shown you, far less out of those things than you get out of just using definitions. And what I have to explain now is why the monetary system has to be included as well. And that's the unique feature that Minsky adds to those software packages. Because have you seen the articles by the Bank of England and the Bundesbank saying that loanable funds is false? The textbook model of money is wrong? Okay. You might not have seen them, so I've got the links here and I'll pass this presentation on. Have a read of the papers. So I've been part of a protest group of economists going back over 50 years, arguing that the idea that banks are intermediaries is simply false. They're not. They create debt, they create money. They do not introduce a saver to a borrower. They create the loan and they create the money at the same time. And the mainstream happily ignored us for the last half century. It's a bit harder to ignore the Bank of England. So they're now being forced to come to us. So even the Bundesbank, I'm really quite surprised by this, came out the same way, saying what they call book money, which is bank-created money, is accounting entries. Money and credit are created as a result of complex interactions between banks, non-banks, and the central bank. And it says banks are not intermediaries. Okay? Okay. And also the money multiplier model is wrong. The central bank doesn't fix the amount of money in circulation, so it doesn't determine the level of the base money, nor is base money multiplied up into more loans. They're all fallacies. And you have to ask yourself, why have we been teaching and learning fallacies for half a century? The Bundesbank, a bank's ability to grant loans and create money has nothing to do with whether it already has excess reserves or deposits. So it's a comprehensive denial of what textbooks still teach. And the people who had the best understanding of money, both the post-Keynesian school in general, but also a very much European-based school called the Circuit School, particularly based in Italy and France. And I highly recommend reading Graziani from 1989. I haven't got a link there, but I'll put it in later. Graziani derived what a monetary economy must be from effectively logical first principles, saying if you're using a commodity as money, you're still in a barter system. Okay? If you say there's a money commodity, all you're saying is you're labeling one of those commodities as the intermediate. You're still working with a barter system. So to be using a true monetary system, you must be using a token that has no intrinsic value. You can't eat a euro. Okay? You can't fly in a euro. You can use them to buy food, you can use them to buy an airline ticket, but they have no intrinsic worth themselves. Whereas a commodity, if you get a lump of gold, you can make it into a prism. Okay? You can make it into a circuit board. Okay? It's something different. So you finally derive that any monetary economy has to be not two agents with two commodities working out a relative price, which is the framework that Neoclassicals use. It's three. It's a buyer with money, a seller with a commodity, and a bank that transfers the money from the buyer to the seller. So you have a triangular arrangement. And then what you get out of this, and I'll show you in a moment, the fact that banks create money is an essential part of the model I've shown you a moment ago. It explains why I should include debt in the system. And this has been a long-running dispute within the post-Keynesian school. I only worked out the solution about 4 or 5 years ago because I was arguing for a long time with my fellow post-Keynesians that credit is part of aggregate demand. I felt that it was intrinsically right. They thought I was intrinsically wrong. And one of the challenges was that I had to be consistent with an identity that expenditure is income at the macroeconomic level. What you spend becomes somebody else's income. Okay? So there's an identity at the macro level between expenditure and income. And they argued I was breaching that. Well, I finally worked out that I could derive it using expenditure equal to income. So I've invented this thing I call a Moore table, and that's in honour of Basil Moore, the leading post-Keynesian economist who pushed the idea of endogenous money. And what I'm showing is on the row, it's expenditure by one sector on two other sectors. So I show the expenditure as a negative, the income is a positive, and therefore each row must equal 0. Okay. And then the diagonal, when you add up the diagonals and take the negative, you have aggregate expenditure. And the off diagonals are aggregate income, and they're necessarily the same. So each row has to sum to 0. Okay. On that basis, the expenditure is income. Columns can differ from 0 because sectoral income can differ from sectoral expenditure. And there's 3 possible monetary arrangements. One is where money exists, but you can't save and you can't lend and you can't borrow. Okay. So I call that Say's law. The textbook model is loanable funds. This is the one Paul Krugman believes describes the real world. You have lending between 2 sectors. Now, lending is shown along the diagonal here because if you go off the diagonal, you're showing expenditure and income. And when you take out a loan, it's neither expenditure nor income. Okay? You don't get taxed on a loan. And then I show where banks originate money and debt. So I bring in a 4th sector, which is a bank that lends to one of the other 3 sectors. So let's look at Say's law. So I have sector 1 spending A dollars per year on sector 2 and B dollars per year on sector 3. And therefore that is equal to that. Okay? And all these flows are in dollars per year, or currency units for per year. C plus E are the income that sector 1 gets from 2 and 3, and that can differ from the expenditure. But overall, what you get out of this is effectively Friedman's money times velocity, because A and B, C and D, E and F are all the rates of flow of money, existing money. So you can say, well, you can simplify that as the velocity of money times the amount of money in existence. So if I do that simplification and add up that the diagonals or the off diagonals, I get money times velocity. Now with loanable funds, I have sector 2 lends money to sector 1, and then of course sector 1 has to pay interest to sector 2, and then sector 1 spends the money they've borrowed on sector 3. Quite simple. So you do that, and I'm calling the rate of flowing credit, which is dollars per year. Credit's a flow of money per year. So there's the flow of credit per year, and there's the expenditure of credit per year. Now, when you sum up the rows and the diagonal, what you get, credit cancels out. Aggregate demand and aggregate income are interest plus money times velocity. So interest turns up as part of the equation. That I didn't expect that. I got a surprise when I got that result. Okay, but it shows that even in loanable funds, the financial sector has to be included as an addition to the turnover of money. And credit cancels out. So if the loanable funds model were correct, you could ignore credit in macroeconomics. Now, the next thing is where I have a bank lending money to sector 1, and sector 1 then spends that money they've borrowed on sector 3. So I've got to bring in a bank assets on one side and liabilities and equity on the other. And so there's new debt created, which changes the assets the banking sector has. Goes to sector 1 and spends the sector on sector 3, and sector 1 spends on has to pay interest to the bank. So there's your creation of credit, there's the expenditure. Now you do the same mathematics I've shown you beforehand, add up and take the negative of the diagonal, or add up the cross elements, and you find credit does not cancel. Credit is part of aggregate demand and aggregate income. Okay. So with that case, you cannot ignore banking in doing macroeconomics. A macroeconomic model without banking is not a model of a capitalist economy. And because credit's incredibly volatile, it tends to dominate the economy. So the turnover of existing money can change. Velocity of circulation can change. The stock of money can change, but they change fairly slowly. Credit can go from positive to negative. Okay? So credit's volatility means it tends to dominate the economy. So this is using my software package Minsky again, and as I've mentioned, there's a number of software packages that already do what Minsky does. What Minsky adds is the capacity to model banks using double entry bookkeeping. So I'll show you this. And then we can have I'll show you quickly how to build a very simple monetary model in Minsky as well. So this is a model based on what Krugman had as a model of loanable funds, a paper with a guy called Eggertson back in 2012 in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. And I'm just going to bring up what we call the Godley tables for both the banker. Oh, suddenly I'll shut that one down. Too many models open at once. So let's go. Okay. So that's the banking sector. And in their model, banks don't lend, so debt doesn't turn up as an asset of the banking sector. Instead, you have a consumer sector that's the saver, an investment sector that's the borrower. So the consumer sector lends money to the investment sector repays that money, the investment sector pays interest, the consumer sector pays a fee to the bank for being the intermediary. Then I have hiring workers, buying intermediate goods, workers consuming, bankers consuming, and bankers investing. Okay? Quite simple dynamics. So the table actually builds a set of differential equations that simulate those flows in the background. And what Minsky is doing is making sure that what's called the fundamental law of accounting applies. Assets minus liabilities minus equity must be zero on each row. So this is a check. If I, for example, have, that, then Minsky tells me I haven't got a balanced row. Okay? So it's just checking that your logic is correct. So I've done that, and over in the corner here, I have a rate of lending and a rate of repayment. And the number says that if effectively lending doubles every 7 years. And the rate here says repayment reduces debt every 9 years. So I can change those numbers and see what happens. So I now simulate, by the model itself, all these things here are definitions. There's no differential equations. Minsky used to find all those in the background from the Godley tables. So there's all these equations back here that you're simulating, but you build this system extremely easily, using the double entry bookkeeping tables. And if I simulate it, I get a growth rate of 0. There's no change in the money supply. At the moment, no change in velocity of circulation. GDP is flatlining. The debt ratio rose from 0 up to about 43% of GDP, but there's no change in the amount of money in the economy. Now, if I increase the rate of lending, If I increase the rate of lending and slow down repayment, notice the growth rate actually drops a bit in that situation. Then it goes back to normal again. So I have now a much higher level of debt, more than 100% of GDP. If I now go in the opposite direction and have repayment happening much more quickly and lending much more slowly, there's actually a spike in growth for a short while. And then finally, you get back to the point where debt's fallen dramatically and nothing much has happened with GDP. So if this was a realistic model of the real world, you could ignore banks, debt and money in macroeconomics. Okay. Now, Minsky's been designed to make it really easy to model financial flows. It's extremely hard to do that with the other system dynamics programs because you've got to change a very complicated wiring diagram. With Minsky, you can just use columns and rows of financial operations. So at the moment, the Loanable Funds says the debt is an asset of the saver, consumer sector. And I can sort of say, well, that's wrong. That's not the real world. So delete debt and delete the financial operations between the consumer sector and the investment sector, which are fictional, and come over to the bank and say, well, let's make room for an extra asset. And Minsky, because I've deleted debt as an asset of the consumer sector, it's still in the model as a liability of the investment sector. So the down arrow goes and, because I'm on the asset side, the down arrow goes and checks for any liabilities that haven't been allocated yet. And D, which stands for debt, is there. You'll notice in these two rows will be filled by the operations that are over here once I click on D. Okay. Now all I've got to do is say, well, interest is actually paid to the bank, and I can delete the bank fee. And there's other changes I should make as well, but I'll just leave it at that just to show the impact of simply going from, say, banks or intermediaries to saying banks create money and debt. So I'll reset it back to where I started with the same values for the rates of lending and rates of repayment. And already we're in a different world because a rising level of debt is causing a rising amount of money. you have positive growth and a growing GDP. If I speed up lending, growth rate accelerates. Slow down lending, the same thing. Oh, sorry, wrong way. I sped up repayment. And now what you can see by those little manipulations is changes in the rates of lending and repayment change GDP. So it's a completely different world, and it's the real world. What you've been learning with loanable funds and money multiplier and ignoring the financial system macro is a fantasy world. So in the model, the neoclassical, you can ignore the banking sector. In the real world, the banking sector is critical. You've got to include it. So what it means is the neoclassicals have been ignoring obvious data that gives us warnings of financial crisis. This is the level, the red line is the level of private debt in America divided by GDP since 1834. And the blue line is the annual change in credit. Now, they still can't explain the financial crisis because according to their model, credit plays no role in aggregate demand. So they collect, the statisticians that they hire in central banks record this data, but they pay no attention to it. Okay? Well, when you look back and say over the long term, what does this tell you about America's economy? It tells you what caused the three biggest crises America had and when they were. So there's negative credit. If you take a look at this line here, the dotted line is zero credit when credit is zero. Above the line it's positive, below the line it's negative. You went from plus 15% in 2007 to minus 5% in 2010. That's what caused the Great Recession. There's the Great Depression, which was even longer, a deeper fall, and it fell to minus 10% rather than just minus 5%. And it stayed there for many years, and it went negative again during what's called the Roosevelt Recession. But I didn't even know about this one until I plotted this data. If you look in Wikipedia, you'll find a fairly good entry in what they call the Panic of 1837. And that was the most severe crisis America had. Looking at it in terms of how it shaped the culture, that's why Americans are into guns. Okay? That's when it was lawless, when robbing a stagecoach was a damn good idea, because the money supply was collapsing because credit was collapsing. And at the same time, the government was also trying to write its debt off, which meant money was disappearing from the American economy. So I think it really shaped American culture and highly worth looking at. And there is those three crises. You can see them. And notice also that Minsky's comment about there's something about the post-war period that works. That's a good and a bad thing because here's the end of the Second World War. And for the whole of that period, right out to 2007, credit was always positive. Now, because credit's the rate of change of debt, the debt ratio kept on rising. So we got to a debt ratio now, which when you normalise the data, is a higher level of debt than the peak of the Great Depression. And we're still stuck in this aftermath. That's why the economy is growing so slowly. And then look back before the Second World War and the Great Depression, and there's negative credit events everywhere. Not just gigantic ones like this, but lots of times when credit is negative. Because it's negative, there are times when the debt level falls again. So we have to, this was not a good time, okay? There were financial crises all the way through here, but you ended up with a lower level of private debt than we've got now. So we need to get to a lower level of private debt without going through crises, if you're looking for a policy to pull out of this. And this now look at the impact credit has on unemployment. And according to neoclassical theory, credit has no impact. That's the red line is credit, which is the annual change in private debt as a percentage of GDP. The blue line is the unemployment rate. When credit goes up, unemployment goes down and vice versa. It's massively negative. And I'll show you the causation goes from credit to unemployment to macroeconomics and the other data. Germany is about the only exception to this relationship, largely because it's relied upon an enormous trade surplus and it's also practicing government austerity, and that dominates what's happening with the credit system in Germany. Not to Germany's benefit, as you can see, because Germany is now in recession, despite the fact that it benefits the most from the euro. You also get a causation from change in household credit to change in house prices. So again, contrary to the efficient markets hypothesis and the Modigliani-Miller theorem. If you've learnt the Modigliani-Miller theorem, okay, saying that the level of leverage has no effect on asset prices, garbage. Okay, it has a massive effect on the asset prices. That's the correlation of the annual change in household credit to the annual change in house prices in America. It's 0.7 over 30 years. So the evidence is overwhelming. Hungary is an interesting example. You guys have got a lot of external factors to deal with as well, but you clearly had a big debt bubble starting from 1998. Okay, this huge increase in private debt there. And then you're in a negative debt. You've been there ever since. You've got plenty of negative credit experiences turning up here, but it does look like the external sector has more impact, much more impact here than in America, because the correlations are nowhere near as powerful. This is looking at credit and unemployment for as far back as I can get unemployment data in Hungary, and the correlation is fairly low. It's about minus 0.3, okay? But it's still there, but nothing as powerful as the States. And in terms of the household debt, this is a common pattern around the world. I've got rising household debt and falling and rising house prices. It looks like there's no relationship. But the real relationship is between change in credit, which is acceleration of private debt, and change in house prices. And when I do that, I don't get a relationship as strong as America's, but I still get about a 0.3, 0.4 correlation. So what drives asset prices is changes in credit. And therefore, that's a reason to control the banking sector and stop them lending for speculation on asset prices, because lending itself causes the change in prices. Now, I'll quickly show you how to build a simple model in Minsky, because I know it's something you haven't seen before. And I'll give you the basics, and if you want to play with it later, you can give it a try yourself. So the simplest part of Minsky is the Godley table. You just click on this icon up here and bring down a bank. You can have multiple banks. I'll call this the banking sector, and build the simplest possible model of a monetary economy. Double click and bring up the table. You can change the size to see things more clearly. Hang on. So I can say, let's say you have reserves here and loans here as assets of the financial sector, and then have firms' deposits and workers' deposits as liabilities, and finally the bank equity over here. And if I then say, for example, there's lending to the firm sector, then I can just type lend there, and I have to type lend over here as well, because you're increasing the assets and increasing the liabilities simultaneously. Repayment reduces liabilities and reduces assets, so money is taken out of the firm's account, and therefore the debt is reduced. And then you have interest payments being made on outstanding debt. So you take money out of here, and that goes to the bank equity. And then you hire workers. So the firms are basically borrowing working capital, so they've got to pay wages, which goes to the workers' bank accounts. And then you have consumption by the workers. So I'll just use underscore here, a down bar like that creates a subscript, and that increases the amount of money in the firm sector. And I have the same for bankers. That's consumption by bankers, which increases the amount of money in the firm sector's account. Now that I've done that, what I've actually defined is a set of differential equations linking all those financial flows together. And I can then say, well, that's looking at it from the point of view of the banking sector. What about seeing it from the firm sector? So I can call this the firm sector. And then open up that table. And click and say what assets haven't yet been shown as what liabilities aren't shown as somebody's assets yet. Well, the deposit account of the firms and the deposit account of the workers are liabilities of the banking sector. They're therefore assets of these non-bank sectors. So if I click on the down arrow, I get these two choices, firms and workers. Minsky brings the operations across for that. If I click on the liability down arrow, it's saying what assets haven't been allocated. The bank account that firms have is one of those liabilities. Hang on a second. Oh, yeah, hang on. There's loans. So it brings across the loans operations. And then I simply have to say, well, interest is taken out of their account, and consumption by bankers and consumption by workers adds to it, and wages are taken out of the firm's equity. And now I'm building an integrated model of the financial sector with additional equations being created by Minsky back here to link it all together. To define that as a model, I right-click and choose copy the flow variable. The flow variables are these over here. The stock variables are here. So I can copy them over here in a group, do the same for the flow equations, bring it over here. This is going to improve. This is a bit cumbersome at the moment in Minsky, so we're working on improving the software to make it less steps to get to where you want to get to. So I ungroup, and I've then got all these are all the accounts that I've got in the banking sector. Do the same for the flows here. Well, let's say I wanted to find interest. Well, interest is the rate of interest multiplied by outstanding loans. So I simply drag those down, both down here. I can zoom in a bit to see the scale more easily. And I can say, well, let's actually bring in the rate of interest on loans as a parameter. You could make this a variable in a model at a later stage, but I'll just pretend it's sort of set at, say, 10%. Maximum is 20%. Minimum, say, 2%. And you can change the step size by 1% if you run a simulation you saw me doing earlier. And then just type a multiply key, and you wire from one to the other and link it together, and you've now defined an equation saying interest is equal to loans multiplied by the rate of interest on loans. And a similar process for all the other components, and you've got a dynamic model like the one I showed you earlier. And so Minsky is generating these equations back here. So there's the one for interest on loans. So we're trying to make it even easier to use, but that's a simple model. This is a complicated one. This is a model of the Portuguese economy done by a PhD student of mine. And he actually works in the statistical agency in Portugal, so he's got first-hand access to the data. And he's built the whole thing based on accounting identities in the national accounts tables. So if you go inside his model, and I saw some potential weaknesses looking at this with a member of the central bank yesterday, but it's still pretty solid. All these things are definitions. This is bringing in external data. So this is household tax rate on the firm sector, tax rate on non-financial sector, tax on production. And then that's generating the data on tax rates over time. So this is all bringing in data and fitting it to data to simulate the economy. The tables themselves, he's aggregated the Treasury and the central bank into one object. I think you should actually break that down. But all these elements here are components in the national accounts. And one advantage of working in monetary terms is you can actually work with the real data, because we don't have data on real output. We have data on nominal. Okay, we convert it into real using price indices and stuff like that. So what neoclassicals are doing is often throwing away information, the whole monetary thing they throw away. If you include it, you get a more accurate model. Now the model looks awful because this is bringing in data, but down the bottom, and I'll just, if you hold the shift key, you can drag up the whole palette and move further down. This is defining government revenue, and it looks like a spider diagram. Okay, when you see it, when I'll show you at the full scale, we're going to take all those elements off the canvas and put it on a separate tab, and you can just write the equation in a single line. And so this mesh you're about to see will be much, much cleaner hopefully in the next 6 months. But that's the entire model. Okay, looks bloody awful. Okay, Pedro understands it, I don't. Okay, but you could use this as a basis for a Hungarian model. Take the same structure, change the constants he has into parameters, fit those parameters to Hungarian data. You'd have a Minsky model of the Hungarian economy. And I'll just simulate it for a short while. Okay. You can see, again, he hasn't labelled the graphs. So this is all stuff you can do. To label a graph, you just right-click and choose options. And this is net government lending and borrowing. Okay. I won't save that, but that's just showing you what you can do. So we can get slightly more informative than at the moment. You simulate the model, and his simulations of the economy are more accurate than the models by the DSGE or the CGE models, the Treasury or the central bank uses, and out of sample forecasts. So it's not just a toy model, as I've shown you, it's a basis for modelling a real economy. And that's what I want us to move to and get away from the neoclassical fantasy. So all that stuff's going to go. It's just definitions. They'll go to a variables tab and a parameters tab maybe in about 6 months' time once we've got all the work put together. This is just showing you how complicated the model can be. Complicated in one sense, simple in another, because all this is taken out of national accounting tables. So all the data becomes the input to define the model itself. And there's also another one of my students who's now working for the Bank of England as an expert on shadow banking, and that's his model of the shadow banking sector. Now this guy's an ex-engineer, so he took to Minsky like a duck to water. He actually complained it was dirty water because there were so many bugs, which we're now addressing. But this is a full model of the shadow banking sector. You can simulate all sorts of different arrangements for repo freezes like we saw a few months ago, dumping reserves to see what impact that has, etc., etc. So you can simulate the actual impact of government policy on the real economy. And I'll finish off with a topic that's now my main area of research, and that is that economic theory not only has it left money and banks and debt out of macroeconomics, it's also left out energy out of production. And that's not just the neoclassicals now, it's also the post-Keynesian school. We're all guilty of it. We've all ignored the role of energy, we've ignored thermodynamics, which means we're completely wrong. So the Cobb-Douglas production function has output as a function of total factor productivity, they call it, and labour and capital. The post-Keynesians tend to use the Leontief production function, where you have a minimum of labour times labour productivity or capital divided by capital output ratio. You can make it into a constant equation by saying it's utilisation of capital divided by the capital output ratio. But I just got this simple insight about 3 years ago that you bring energy in by saying that without energy, neither labour nor capital can function. Labour without energy is a corpse. Capital without energy is a sculpture. To energise them, to motivate them, you've got to have energy. So you rewrite L and K not as functions of time, but as function of E at time t. So I've got E lambda for the energy input to labour and E kappa for energy input to capital. Now, if you then feed that into both of those equations and then work it through, well, how do you define E lambda? Well, E lambda is effectively the number of workers. EK is the number of machines. That is difficult to define. That's what's called the Cambridge controversies over the nature of capital. We need to work out a way of measuring how many machines there are. There's the energy input into labour and the energy input into machinery. Now, both have been growing exponentially over time. The amount of energy you consume on a daily basis would make a king jealous from 2 centuries ago. We tend to ignore that, but that's what's actually caused the increase in our standard of living. And little EL and little EK, the efficiency with which that energy is turned into useful work. Now, the expression for labour, even though the amount of energy we consume is enormous, the amount of energy we can actually put into work is constant. Okay? You are no more capable of working at unskilled labour than a Roman slave. Okay? So it's roughly 100 watts is about the maximum you can manage for roughly half a day. And then you'll go back and, you won't sleep. You'll be sleeping the sleep of the dead. So that's about a constant. You can replace that with a little l as a constant. But the amount of energy going into machinery has risen from not trivial levels, but risen dramatically over time. So if you look at the James Watt steam engine, that consumed about 10 tonnes of coal per day. If you look at the Falcon 9, which is the most powerful machine on the planet, with the sole exception of CERN, that machine consumes roughly 10 tonnes of oil per second. So we're talking 25,000 time increase in energy consumption. That's where our real wealth has come from over time. And that's why the ecology is in danger as well, because we're dumping that into the environment. And we also have a necessary link between energy and waste, which is left out completely of economic theory. It's not an externality. Waste is a necessity. Okay? You cannot have production without waste. Calling it externality is nonsense. It's not understanding the laws of thermodynamics. So waste is necessarily produced because of the second law of thermodynamics. We know that the energy input must be less than the energy converted into useful work. There's your first approximation for the waste. And we also know that because of the second law, there must be more disorder created than there is order. So the impact of the waste, the scale of the waste, measured in energy terms, has to be greater than the scale of the production. Okay. So we get rid of a whole range of puzzles by doing this as well. If you feed those terms, as I've shown you, L times EL and K times EK, etc., into the Cobb-Douglas production function and rearrange it, what you end up with is the original Cobb-Douglas production function. Now the other stuff, which they call total factor productivity, is actually the efficiency, the amount of energy turned into useful work by machines. It's not a puzzle at all. Okay? It's the increase in the energy processing capability of machines over time. And if you put it into the Leontief function, and I'm using U for capacity utilization here, and then bring in the energy as I've shown you there, I have to have a relationship between output measured in terms of widgets or a corn economy, which is Y, but also output in terms of energy. So I need a conversion factor between the two, energy per widget. Okay. When you cancel common terms, terms that have similar dimensions, V and EK are both scalars. EK and EY are both energy. Okay. So you equate common terms, and what you find is that V is actually the ratio of energy to useful work. So what we've been using with V is not a capital output ratio, it's an efficiency of energy conversion by machinery. So if I take a look at the data on the what we call the accelerator in standard post-Keynesian economics, even in neoclassical, that's been falling over time. When you look at what it actually is, it's rising efficiency of converting energy into useful work. But it's still got to be below 0.5. Okay, and I think it's going to go down when we start hitting energy constraints in the next decade or two. Now, so you've got the solar residual is now energy consumption of machinery over time. Of course that explains most of the increase in productivity. Not a puzzle at all. And you can now link economic models to ecology because the gap between the total energy input and the useful work output must be positive. And that therefore means that you pollute the environment. And of course CO2 is the main form of it. And then if we start seeing declining energy return and energy investment, we're going to see a fall in that efficiency of conversion rate. And we're going to see a decline in GDP, and it could be extremely substantial. So I want to show with a very simple model that you can bring all this stuff together. And this is using the flowchart style of Minsky now rather than the Godley table system. So what I've added to the basic model on which I've built the Minsky model I showed you earlier is what's called Goodwin model. That leaves the banking sector out. It's just a case that it'd be a day's work maximum to bring it in there as well. But what I have is I've got a level of resources in the system and a rate of depletion, okay, reflecting how much of that energy you're using. And I haven't factored in the existence of alternative energy sources yet, which of course at the moment are only about 3% of our total energy output anyway. So 97% of our energy is still coming from fossil fuels. Okay, so saying it's 100% here is not much of an exaggeration. So I model this system. You can get the fixed cycles that are part of the Goodwin model going on, it looks like, indefinitely. You've also got output and waste exceeds output over here. Because exponential growth is going on, nothing really happens until right towards the end. And suddenly you start to reduce the amount of available fossil fuels left, and then you have an economic collapse. Now that's running out of resources version of a collapse. There's many others. I could have shown a waste version there as well. So I recommend, as a final suggestion, this software evolved from the software that built the limits to growth study back in the 1970s. So go on the website, on the web, and find limits to growth and have a look at that. That is what we should have been using as the foundation of economics for the last 50 years. And neoclassical economists, in particular William Nordhaus, played a major role in disparaging, without understanding, that whole approach to economics. So we should have been doing the stuff I'm showing you here 50 years ago. And if we had, we would have realised the seriousness of climate long before we got to the situation we're in. And if you look at the nature of the neoclassical studies of climate change, it is the worst garbage I've read in my whole life of reading neoclassical economics. I've never seen such shit, pardon the French. There's crazy assumptions they make. They talk about simplifying assumptions. Here's the key one. One of the key ones they made to generate artificial data to fit their stupid models to. They assumed that the observed variation of economic activity with climate over space, in other words, differences in income given differences in climate today, will hold over the future. That's nonsense. That is sheer, unadulterated nonsense. But that's the basis of the so-called data they fitted their model to. Now, on top of that, they've used an equilibrium framework for looking at a distinctly non-equilibrium process. Okay? I'm viscerally seeing that right now because several members of my family live in forested areas of Australia. And one of them is 25 kilometres from a farm fire which has just destroyed some of the buildings on her best friend's property. Okay? It's not an equilibrium process. You shouldn't be using equilibrium models to say what the impact is going to be, but that's what they're doing. So I think mainstream economics has delayed proper action on climate change as much as any oil company or coal miner or right-wing ideologue. And I really think we either have a new paradigm for economics or capitalism is going to fail because of neoclassical economics. Because they're saying it's all trivial and a 4-degree increase in temperature will only cause a 3.6% fall in GDP. And that is so wrong, it makes what they predicted for the financial crisis look accurate. When it starts to strike, it won't be a capitalist economy that copes with it. It'll be a militarised one, a war economy. So I'm trying my best to get rid of them before they get rid of us. Okay, thank you. Any questions? Bit stunned?